In the sprawling hills and wooded acreage of southern Indiana lies the small town of Salem. Originally founded in 1814, the small village would have very little to claim for itself until 1863, when it became host to the infamous raids of John Hunt Morgan. However, nearly 80 years later, after the end of the Second World War, the town began a fascination with speed and adrenaline. And in 1947, in the sprawling hills outside of the heart of the town, a racetrack was cut into the soil. Banked at a daunting 33 degrees, 3,000 would gather at the brand new Salem Speedway to watch heroes from the war race for at-home glory. It was a joyous occasion for many of the townsfolk. It had been so long for some since they had seen racers from the past take to the challenges of the dirt track. Excitement was pegged, and the fire department of Salem saw the specter and jumped on the opportunity to fundraise, whilst the mayor of Salem at the time would climb up in the wooden flag stand and take over his honorary starting duties. He would watch the first heat of cars assemble and idle around the steep hills. Off the final corner they came, a chorus of engines sprinting into the first corner. The current track record holder, 39-year-old Clay Corbett, would sprint his number 36 off-announcer entry into the first corner. He would argue for position with outside starter Jack Schultz over who would lead through the first corner. The two would grab wheels and go airborne. They would touch the wall and jump over it. On the other side of the retaining fence was a steep 30-foot drop, a fall into a mix of trees and parked cars. Corbett and Schultz would both fly down into that ravine, Clay being killed by the time he reached the bottom of the hill. Schultz would be critically injured, dying from complications 5 years later. Before a lap was complete in competition, the hills had claimed its first and second victims, casting a long shadow over the track, as many daredevils would come to fear what would be called the Hills of Death. As time went on, many would learn to conquer the track. Most of the men who did this had faced far worse challenges than that of southern Indiana. Drivers like Rex Mays, Ted Horn, and Duke Dinsmore all played with fate in Europe. Mays was a pilot, hardening his courage with endless dogfights over the European theater. Horn, whilst volunteering to fight, was denied for his previous racing injuries, centering his focus on only one thing to prove: his bravery through racing. And Dinsmore also flew over much of Europe, making these three men the perfect to write the early history of Salem Speedway. However, one man prevailed out of all of them, the determined and methodical veteran, Duane Carter. Unlike many of the youthful drivers who had stepped up onto the banking at Salem in tumultuous fear, Carter had seen steeper. He had dominated taller banks, and the hills were just that. His courage came from years of board track racing on the West Coast, where many of these tracks consisted of banking north of 40 degrees, and some even as steep as 50. Carter had dominated them all, becoming a renowned driver in America and even across seas in New Zealand. He won the debut race at the track called Western Spring Stadium. And Carter was also college educated, attending Fresno State, and it made his thought process for racing precise, calculated, and knowing exactly how far he could push his limits of his car and career. His race day usually consisted of scouting the track before every race, surveying the risk and potential outcome of every wreck that could occur if something were to go wrong. Whilst Carter was a veteran, his biggest rival was a driver who was an infant when he was dominating the boards, a young Troy Rutman. Troy had lied about his age to get into the track. By the age of 19, he already had accrued speed records, championships, and a full-time AAA sprint car ride. His rival, Carter, would respect the teenager like a veteran, but not flinch at his pure talent. Rutman respected Carter as well, but envied his cool nerves and calculated approach. Troy was constantly anxious, vomiting from nervousness before each race, and surviving off nothing but water and medication. But to the local spectator at Salem, he was the Iceman, always playing with a 100-mile-an-hour barrier around the track, and dueling repeatedly with Carter throughout the early 50s. The duels wouldn't last forever, though, as Rutman's fame grew quickly, exploding with his 1952 Indy 500 victory. And Carter, growing older, eventually retired in the mid-50s, opting for a career in officiating. Whilst the racing stunned spectators, the hills still claimed souls. In 1949, Tommy Matson and Chuck Barbeau died after they both collided and flew over the wall, falling to their deaths. In 1954, a young Wally Campbell took to the banking for the very first time, thanks to an invitation by Troy Rutman. Campbell had ran primarily stock cars through his career, running the first Southern 500. He'd also run the first full season of NASCAR modified racing in 1948, and Campbell would turn his first laps in a sprint car testing at Salem. Rutman would watch on as Wally suddenly would exit high off of turn 2 and lose control. The car would slap the wall and jump it. He would launch off the hills, down a 50-foot drop. Rutman and other crewmen ran to the site of the crash and came across perhaps the eeriest sight ever seen at a speedway. The fuel tank had burst and lit the hayfield around the car on fire where it had landed. And inside the burning straw was the car, right side up, engine running. Wally sat in the seat unconscious, but hung on the throttle, with the wheel pinched all the way to the left. The car was aimlessly turning tight circles, one after another, making it nearly impossible to try and get to the car through the fire. After countless feeble attempts and Rutman burning himself, he finally jumped onto the car and quickly turned it off. They rushed Wally to a local hospital where he would pass shortly after. And Rutman, who was once king of the hills, was now terrified of him. He had fallen out of racing shape since an injury in 1952, and once returning to Salem, he would back out of a race saying, "The hills scare me to death now." His dominance had come to an end, and another had begun. The 1955 winner of the Indy 500, Bob Sweikert, had begun proving himself as a prolific sprint and midget car driver. He would dominate across the mid-50s as one of the best, and his top rival, Pat O'Connor, always pushed him at tracks like Salem. The two would always duel, similar to Carter and Rutman, with Pat teasing Bob to not drive so fast. But Sweikert would win the 1955 Indy 500 with lessons learned from Salem, and O'Connor was very much on his way to eventually winning a 500 as well. But much like Rutman, he'd be the second driver hardened on the banks of Salem to win the illustrious race. In the following year, in 1956, he would return to the hills to continue a successful and burgeoning career. He found himself racing around the track with driver Ed Elysian, a man, by many accounts, Sweikert adamantly hated, and he refused to finish behind him at a track he had mastered so well. He pushed the car, trying to catch Elysian, until he slid and hit the wall. Bob would go over the barrier, and did what so many had done before, tumble down the hill, over 30 feet into treetops and rocks. The wreck would end up killing Sweikert, and claiming another man who appeared to at one time master the hills. As the 50s pushed on, Pat O'Connor would dominate without his rival till his death in 1958, leaving way for the next generation, Eddie Sachs, Parnelli Jones, and a young A.J. Foyt. They would dominate sprint car racing at the Oval, while a new series would grow quickly in popularity as well, the Mark Racing Series, or current-day ARCA. It would be the first stock car events that would be held at the track, most won by sprint car and midget drivers Don Branson. And by the end of the 50s and early 60s, the track was building recognition, and slowly but surely, while it wouldn't secure any major racing series, it was a staple of men's bravery and many ladder systems through the 60s as well. During this time in 1962, a private airstrip would be built next to the track, chopping down many of the trees that had tortured drivers that had fallen from the hills in the early years of the track. As workmen cleared the forest, they would have an object fall from one of the limbs. Upon inspection, it was discovered to be the missing rear-end chassis assembly from the Bob Sweikert car 6 years prior. The portion of the car had been notably missing for years since Sweikert's fatal crash, and the rusted hunk of metal, while concluding the story, reminded many that the hills will never care who you are or what you have done. During a 1965 race, two spectators by the name of Hayden Daugherty and Cornelia Ferris would set up a picnic on the backstretch infield camping area. They would watch mechanic Steve Donninger warm up the number 7 Ford for his driver by turning some moderately paced laps around the track. Suddenly, a tire would blow, and he would spin into the infield, smashing through the barrier and striking both Daugherty and Ferris. Both would perish in the accident, sadly ending a desolate period in the hills, bloodlust against human curiosity. As the 60s pushed on, drivers like Mario Andretti, Roger McCluskey, Benny Parsons, and Gary Bettenhausen would win at the track. And the Speedway would claim another in Gil Hess, who would fly out of the track, claiming another life as it tumbled down the hills. However, in 1970, a miracle would occur. 2 crashes would happen with both drivers going out of the track, and both of them surviving. It was in part thanks to a more secure wall, giving people the assurance that the days of the hills was coming to an end. It was also encouraged by a temporary abandonment of sprint car and midget racing at the banks, instead favoring the quickly growing late model series, ASA, and ARCA, and the USAC stock car series. Drivers like Darrell Waltrip and Bobby Allison started dominating the banks, before a return to the sprint and midget car racing, thanks to Duane Carter's son, Pancho Carter. These men would dominate the Speedway through the 70s, Pancho reviving sprint cars as they exploded back in the end of the 70s. But as the 80s were closing in on the track, a storm was brewing. Quite literally. In 1981, a severe thunderstorm would roll through and destroy much of the track structures, leaving the facility in complete disarray. It would be eventually abandoned, and for much of the 80s, the hills that captivated thousands for the better part of a century was nothing more than a relic of a bygone era of motorsports. Similar to the board tracks of the 1920s it resembled, it was also abandoned, and nature had begun to reclaim it. That was until Don Gettelfinger bought the track in 1987. He'd bring it back to life, and have racing return in October of the same year. The first race back would be an ARCA event, won by Bob Keselowski. The next year, midgets and Silver Crown cars returned with Rich Vogler and Bob Fry, claiming victory and dominating into the early 1990s. They would establish a new event called the Halloween 200, and new drivers like Jeff Gordon would also battle at the high banks. But the hills were not done, as it would claim another racing icon on July 21st, 1990. Leading over Jeff Gordon, Rich Vogler would approach a lap car that did not estimate his closing speed, and he made contact with him, causing a vicious impact with the outside wall and claiming Rich Vogler's life. He was considered by many one of the best sprint car drivers of not only his generation, but of all time. And a few years later, in 1994, another driver would be killed by the name of Ray Hanna, another promising star who had just won the Superstock Championship at Winchester earlier that season. In 1995, Gettelfinger would go bankrupt, and the couple, Owen and Beverly Thompson, would buy the track, making sweeping upgrades. However, they would deal with tragedy almost immediately, as a tire would fly off from an accident and strike a 7-year-old girl by the name of Lindsay Maiden. She was there with her family on another exciting trip to Salem Speedway, as her family had deep racing ties. She would pass away 4 days later from the accident, and this would be thankfully the last fatality at the track up to current day. As the Speedway moved into the early 2000s, it would hold many sprint car and midget races, alongside late model and other local events. The track over the last 7 years has changed ownership 3 times, still holding on as a staple of Midwestern speed and excitement. The track record was set earlier this year by Cody Swanson, clocking a 15.809 second lap, with an average speed of over 125 miles an hour. Much has changed at Salem over its 80-year history, but one thing has stayed constant: the hills. For they stand today as a symbol of bravery of men that have helped build the legacy of auto racing. It has helped capture many of our fascinations for years, but they also remind you to respect them, honor their legacy, for you never know when the hills will make you pay.